suppose we should start our session, but if it's any consolation, I'm planning to do a relatively short presentation and then have a lot of time for questions and discussion. Because I think that's more enjoyable and it's probably going to be more useful to you all. So, my name's Ian Mosley. I'm the Latin and Logic teacher here at School of the Ozarks. And what I want to talk to you about today is what we're doing in the elementary in Latin, how we can maybe change that so that it's better supporting what we're doing in the upper grades. Because that's the whole idea of what we're doing in the elementary grades, is we're trying to lay a foundation for work that we want to do later on in the middle school and upper grades. So I want to talk about what we were doing in the elementary Latin grades, how I was seeing that as they moved up through the grades, and that's partly to do with the fact that I have a nice position being the 5th grade through 10th grade Latin teacher. So I'm getting them just on the tail end of that grammar stage and then leading them up through that, what we would call the logic stage, and then I also get to work with them just a little bit in the rhetoric stage. So I've gotten a really valuable opportunity to see how their foundation that they're getting in the elementary school is either serving them or not serving them as they move up through the grades. And so I want to talk about that and what things I was noticing about that seemed to be working and not to be working. And then I want to talk a little bit about the history of Latin curricula and what a Latin curriculum would have looked like maybe like 200 years ago or even 500 years ago. And how we might be able to learn something from that about how we can change our elementary Latin curricula so that they might better serve the purposes of the upper grades. Then I want to talk about what I did about that and what my results have been so far. So like I said, a relatively short presentation. I want to have a long time for discussion and questions. We can go in a variety of different directions when we start asking questions. If you want to just talk about what this presentation is mainly about, which is how we can do elementary Latin better, that's fine. I'll take any questions you want to ask about that. If you have just general questions about Latin pedagogy, what we do at different levels at this school, or anything of that sort, I'd be happy to answer questions about that. So we're free to go in that direction. And I also love to talk about the history of classical education. What did a Christian classical school look like 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, and how we might be able to learn from that, or at least things that are interesting about the way those schools used to be structured. So I'm very happy to go in any of those directions if we'd like to go in those directions during the question and answer session. Or just anything about Latin. I love talking about Latin. And that is, I made this offer to someone individually, but I'd like to make it to you all in general. Make sure you know that's open to you all in general. My email is Mosley, Mosley. People always want to put an extra E in there. I guess this looks like it should be Mosley or something like that. But mosley@cofo.edu. I'd be happy if you ever have a question about Latin or thoughts about Latin pedagogy or Latin programs, and you want to email or ask a question or just discuss something or bounce some ideas. I'd love to do that anytime. Okay. So, what do Latin elementary curricula look like? In general, they have a very similar appearance. If you looked at Memoria presses, for example, or if you looked at classical academic press, there's probably others I'm not aware of, but the ones I am aware of, Logos uses Kraken Latin, they have a very similar format. There's usually a vocab list of 8 to 10, maybe a few more vocabulary words in Latin and English that the students are to memorize, usually for a weekly quiz. There's usually some kind of grammatical paradigm. It might be the first declension endings. It might be a moa, mas, amat, what have you. There's a grammatical paradigm that they're supposed to memorize, again to reproduce on a quiz. Sometimes, this is true of classical academic press, there will be some grammatical explanations of like what's going on with these paradigms, how do we use these paradigms, how do we translate. And then there's generally some sort of worksheet to go along with that. And so when I started teaching, I've used the Memoria Press curricula before. I used those when I was teaching up in Springfield, at a school in Springfield. And then when we came down here, we decided to go with the Classical Academic Press Latin for Children books over Memoria. And my motivation in making that choice was mainly that I thought the grammatical explanations in classical academic press were better and more detailed. And I liked that there was more stories to translate. You can get that libellus de historia, and they get little stories that they have to translate. I thought that was good. And then I feel like it had most of the same things that Memoria did as well. So I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. I felt that I was just like adding some things on. And we've used that since I've been here, so like, what is it, like 4 years now, Mrs. Carey, that we've been using that curriculum here. And since I teach across all those grade levels, I was seeing what they were retaining as they moved up and what they didn't retain. So in 6th and 7th grade, we switched to Wheelocks. And we just do as much as we can of Wheelocks. I mean, it's a college level curriculum. They can't really understand it on their own. They can barely understand it if you read it together in class. So I mainly use Wheelocks as a source of translation exercises and as a sort of general outline of what we want to cover in terms of grammar. We might cover 8 or 9 chapters in a school year. Not a lot. We're by no means are we going to cover the entire Wheelocks book in 6th and 7th. And then in 8th, 9th, and 10th, when they're moving into the late middle school and the early high school, we switch to Warburgslingua Latina, which I'd be happy to answer questions about that if you want to talk more about that during the question and answer. It's a very interesting curriculum. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's got some advantages and some disadvantages. But I do like teaching with that in 8th, 9th, and 10th. And then 10th is the last year they take Latin. So, as I was seeing kids that had worked with Latin for Children move up into doing Wheelocks, and then now I'm seeing some of those kids move into doing Lingua Latina, what were they retaining from their elementary study and what were they not retaining? The paradigms I found they were retaining really, really well. All my kids, when they came to me, could say amo, amas, amat, amam, mus, amatis, amant. They could rattle off the I, am, I, remis, as, is. And that was no mean benefit. That was actually quite beneficial to them as they were moving up. I had one group of 8th graders that I just started with Lingua Latina. A lot of them had no experience with Latin prior to that, and we just jumped right into Lingua Latina. And it was a struggle for them, to be honest, because you still have to memorize a lot to understand the language properly. And it was a slog for them having to try to understand what was going on with Lingua Latina and try to memorize all that information at the same time. It was difficult for them. And so I've definitely seen those paradigms really giving a boost in confidence and a boost in their ability to work with the language as I'm seeing kids move up from the lower grades and having those paradigms memorized already when they first get exposed to Lingua Latina. So the paradigms were working really well. The vocabulary was not being retained whatsoever. Yeah. Not at all. I would have maybe occasionally like 1 or 2 students that had maybe like near photographic memories. And when we would run across a word that we learned in 5th grade and 6th grade, they'd be like, oh, we learned that in 5th grade. And I'd be like, very good.
A student asked me what deity is. I can't find it in the dictionary on the screen.
Right, exactly. So I didn't notice them returning the vocabulary at all, except for maybe like those 1 or 2 students that have like almost perfect memories. And so I was saying to myself, this is disappointing, because I'm spending in the 5th grade, in the elementary grades, I'm spending about half of my time working on memorizing vocabulary, talking about derivatives to vocabulary. And it seems like this time is not being well used because they're not retaining the vocabulary as they're moving up in grades. And I was thinking to myself, well, okay, why is this? Why is what we're doing with paradigms seem to be working so well and what we're doing with the vocabulary not working so well? And what it comes down to, I think, is that I'm pretty sure you can say this, almost nobody can learn vocabulary just from memorizing a vocabulary list. The brain just doesn't work like that. You have to encounter vocabulary in some kind of meaningful context in order to really assimilate it. And a vocabulary list just does not give enough context for them to retain the vocabulary. Now, when they're translating a sentence in Wheelocks and they're having to see the same word in different contexts and translating it over and over again, that seems to really help them with vocabulary. When they're seeing a word in Lingua Latina and it's introduced to them through pictures, or they have to infer the meaning from context, and they're having to actually work to get at the meaning of that word, that seems to work pretty well for them in terms of retaining vocabulary. Because again, I think that the difference is that they're being given a meaningful context on which to hang that thing. But in the vocabulary lists just were not working for me. So I asked myself the question, like, why are we spending so much time on something that doesn't seem to be working? And another thing that I didn't seem to be seeing the benefit of was the worksheets that came along with my curriculum. Moria Press has these worksheets, Classical Academic Press has these worksheets, and you probably had this experience. Elementary students don't know when they don't understand something. If you're working with middle schoolers or high schoolers and you're like lecturing to them something about what they don't understand, you'll start to see that frowny face or the furrowed brow, or they'll start to get a little uncomfortable. You can lecture to fifth graders all day about something they don't know, and they'll just be smiling back. Yeah, right on, Mr. Mosley. And you'll ask them a question, like what did I just lecture to you on, and they'll have no idea. So what I was finding was that my elementary students would just happily fill out these worksheets, very cheerfully, flipping back and forth, and they were understanding nothing. There'd be a translation, like on the Moria Press worksheets, translate "you love" into Latin. How many times has your student put "amos" when you asked for "you love"? It's always "amo," right? Maybe a really clever student will say like "tu amo." He'll remember what the word for "you" is and put that in front of "I love." But they're very cheerfully doing their work while not understanding how much they're not understanding. So that to me was not working very well. This also seemed like it was a waste of time. So another thing I noticed as they were moving up into the upper grades, there was a lot of terminology I was wanting them to have a handle on that they really didn't. I wanted them to understand terms like first person, second person, and third person, and maybe not even understand those terms, but at least have some kind of mental framework on which I can hang a meaning of those terms, some kind of frame of reference that would enable it to be something other than just an abstract term to them, and they didn't have it. And I was, well, so why is this? I'm thinking, like, why is this the case? And if you look at Classical Academic Press, for example, they have these great grammatical explanations that they give for like the functions of the different cases. But those explanations go on for paragraphs and paragraphs. To explain what the nominative case does, it takes up a whole page. It's probably like 200 words. And they might understand it when they're reading it, but there was nothing that they could take away with the way they memorized the paradigms. There was nothing that they could take away from that they could just hold in their memory. Like the nominative case does blank. Something short and succinct like that they could memorize. Now, of course, you can do the thing like you do, never give Davis any apples and Spido. That helps a little bit if they've got a good command of Shirley grammar. But at least in our case, sometimes they don't get to the direct object in Shirley for a long time, which is the bane of my existence. If Shirley just put the direct object earlier, my life would be so much easier. But a lot of times they haven't gotten to the direct object yet. So saying Spido and saying the accusative is the direct object, you might as well be speaking Chinese to them. They have no idea what that means or how to translate that into understanding Latin syntax. So I was coming away with these observations. They're not learning the vocabulary because the vocabulary lists don't work. They are learning the paradigms, so good, that's helping. They're not getting the benefit from the worksheets. And I'm wanting them to have at least some kind of succinct definition they can give me from memory of what these different syntactical terms mean that they can use later on, but they're not getting it right now. Okay, so I'm thinking through these problems, and I can very much identify with Mr. Selby's presentation about going ad fontes, because that's a process that really fascinates me and really gets me fired up, is looking at what were classical educators doing 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 500 years ago. What textbooks were they using, or 1,000 years ago for that matter? What can we learn from the way that they were teaching back then? And during the course of my studies, I encountered an English grammarian by the name of William Lillie. William Lillie, who probably composed the most influential textbook of all time. William Lillie. He was an English grammarian. He was a contemporary of Henry VIII, and he composed a work that he called A Short Introduction of Grammar. So you can find William Lillie, A Short Introduction of Grammar. And grammar here means Latin grammar, as it generally did in the olden days. A Short Introduction of Grammar by William Lillie. It was, some of this was a collaborative. He collaborated with a humanist named John Colet, Johannes Coletus. He collaborated with Desiderius Erasmus, who was in the area at the time and very influential in educational circles. And they were sort of cooking up, like, how are we going to teach kids Latin? Because, I mean, I don't want to go too much into this if it's going to be tedious, but of course, in the Renaissance, you get a very revolutionary change in Latin pedagogy, because people no longer want to do medieval Latin. They want to go back to Ciceronian Latin, the way the Romans would have spoken the language and used the language. And really the language that we teach today. Most of us are aiming to have students understand classical Latin, not necessarily medieval Latin. So there was a bit of a pedagogical crisis, because how are we going to get kids to understand this? People have been speaking medieval Latin for centuries and centuries. How are we going to restore this purer Ciceronian idiom and teach kids how to compose in it and understand it and speak it? So the solution they came up with was to write some grammatical texts for the study of school children. And so part of this text, which is called A Short Introduction of Grammar, was written in English. And then there was another part to the grammatical text that was written in Latin. It's called the Brevissima Institutio, the briefest introduction, the briefest overview of Latin grammar. But I'm going to focus mainly on the part that was written in English, because I think we can learn a lot from it. So this is what a Latin curriculum looked like in the Renaissance, at least in England at this time. And what I noticed about it, looking it over, because you can read it online, it's at your disposal, it mainly focused on teaching two things to children. It focused on teaching them the Latin paradigms, and it focused on teaching them short definitions of grammatical terms that they could then apply later on when they were doing translations. So it's, the clouds parted, the light comes down from the skies. They knew what they were doing. They were teaching those things that the students were actually able to master. So, for example, the nominative case. As I mentioned, an explanation of what the nominative case does in a Latin textbook, even on the elementary level, might run to 200 to 300 words. There's no way anyone's going to memorize that. William Lillie's definition of what the nominative case does is the nominative case cometh before the verb and answers the question what or who. That's his definition of what the nominative case does. Now, obviously, that's an oversimplification. He's relying on your knowledge of English word order to convey what the nominative case does. He's not using technical terms like subject or object, because he thinks kids aren't going to understand that. But he's giving something that's simple, but which can be fleshed out later on when they're actually doing Latin translations. But for that moment, he was happy for them just to say, what is the nominative case? The nominative case cometh before the verb and answers the question what or who. And he gives an example in English and Latin. Magister docet, the master teaches. So again, a very simple explanation, but something where they could have a little hook to hang something on later when they were doing more complicated translations later on. So I said, this is great. This is exactly what I'm looking for. This is a Latin curriculum that's teaching the two things that it seems like they can master and retain at the elementary level. And it seems like it's going to be very beneficial to them later on when they're working with translations. And I just to go a little bit more into the history, this is probably the most influential textbook ever written. By a decree of Henry VIII, it was the only lawful Latin textbook you could use in his realm. So Henry VIII comes out with a decree. He says, if you're teaching Latin, you got to use what William Lillie wrote. That's the only thing you can use. That was reaffirmed as late as the 1604 canon laws of the Church of England. Said it's kind of interesting. These are the canon laws of the Church of England, right? The laws that the church can enforce, because in England you have a cooperation between church and state. There's not a separation, strictly speaking, but they do have their own spheres of authority. And there's a portion of those canon laws of schoolmasters, which is kind of interesting to think that the education was something that was supposed to be regulated by the church. And it mandates two things that schoolmasters have to teach. They have to teach William Lillie's grammar, and they have to teach the church catechism. Those were the two mandated subjects at every grammar school in England at that time. And theoretically, it's still enforced today, though not observed. But William Lillie's textbook became the standard textbook for hundreds of years in England. In fact, if you go as late as something like the public school Latin grammar primer, which I think was produced, I want to say the 1830s or 1840s. It was pretty much the standard grammatical textbook throughout the Victorian age, and then even into early 20th century. I think it was only fully abandoned maybe in the 1960s in Great Britain. Even that public school Latin primer followed a format very similar to William Lillie's. And in fact, some of it is verbatim what is in William Lillie. Short grammatical explanations, paradigms, and some mnemonic devices to help you with things like dedi is the perfect stem of do, da, re. So again, a textbook that lasted from the time of Henry VIII right until the 20th century. Probably a greater longevity than most textbooks can claim. Okay, so I found this Latin textbook. I'm like, this really seems to do exactly what I want it to do, but I toyed with the idea of just like using it just verbatim, just like let's just print out copies of this and just distribute it to the students. Working with Mrs. Carey, my curriculum instructor on that, she's like, well, maybe we should update some of this language. It's kind of written in older English. It was written during the Renaissance period. Let's maybe like try to update it and do our own thing with it. I'm like, okay, I can do this. So I went through a process of transcribing it, simplifying it in some sections, because he's really obsessed with detail, but I have the luxury of covering a lot of that detail later, so I don't need to be quite as detailed as he is on some points. And then sort of putting it into a format where we can print it out and put it into the hands of students. And that's what we ended up doing. And so this has been our pilot year, working with my version of William Lillie's grammar for the elementary school. And so far, I've been using it with 5th graders. So far, I've been very happy with it. My 5th graders can recite 5 different examples of the 5 declensions of Latin nouns. So they know 1st declension, 2nd declension, 3rd declension, 4th declension, 5th declension. They know both types of Latin adjectives. They can do an usa, adjective, or they can do a 3rd declension adjective. They can make a 3rd declension adjective agree with a 4th declension noun, or a 1st and 2nd declension adjective agree with a 5th declension noun. Whatever you want them to do, they're going to be able to make those adjectives agree with the nouns, which is just it is an exercise that some of my high school students do not relish. So I'm hoping that's going to be a great preparation for them later on when they're doing that. They have memorized almost verbatim most of the textbook. I can ask them questions like, what is the genitive case? And they'll be able to give me a succinct definition, which they don't fully understand yet, but they will hopefully later on. And I guess I should go back to that point about worksheets too, because I think worksheets aren't half as useful as just verbal drills. That's where you really have to cut past that elementary tendency to just give you the smiling face back. They need instant verbal feedback about whether they're right or not. So I'm not content for them to go, for example, amo, amas, ama, amamus, amatus, amant. I need to be able to call on anybody and say, what's the second person plural of amo? And they have to give me back amatus, right? That's something that may have been obvious to you guys for a long time, but it's something that was a kind of a revelation to me, that it's not enough for them to repeat these chants as if they were like reciting the alphabet. It's fine to say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, because that's a one-dimensional piece of information, right? But a declension or a Latin conjugation is a multi-dimensional piece of information. It's like a times table. It's fine to recite a times table at first just by route. 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 plus 3 is 6, 2 plus so on and so forth. But eventually you want them to be able to just, boom, give you 6 plus 7 right away. Not have to go through all the 6 plus 1, 6 plus, or 6 times 1, 6 times 2, 6 times 3, and so on and so forth. You want them to be able to, boom, give you 6 times 7. That's exactly the kind of recall we should be trying to cultivate with Latin declensions and Latin conjugations. And that's actually something William Lillie mentions in his grammar as well, that they shouldn't just know the conjugations and declensions in order, but they should be able to give you any form that you ask for instantly, and preferably also the translation of it. And going from English to Latin and Latin to English, as you know, is a very useful exercise in training their understanding. So, my philosophy, get rid of worksheets, get rid of vocab lists, focus on what they can master and retain, which is vocabulary and succinct definitions of grammar terms. That's the best way to make elementary Latin serve Latin in the upper grades.
Vocabulary.
I misspoke. I meant to say paradigms. Focus on the paradigms. Focus on succinct grammatical definitions. Drop the vocab list. Drop the worksheets. That's it. I haven't done any vocabulary with my 5th grade beyond if we're doing like a 4th declension noun like haec manus. They know manus means hand, but that's obviously a very limited set of vocabulary. They maybe know a dozen words in Latin, but I'm waiting to train their vocabularies in a way that I think is actually going to be a way they can retain when they're actually doing translation in 6th and 7th grade, and when they're doing readings in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. Let's just open it up for questions then, because that's mainly what I wanted to talk about.
So do you have them doing any translation at all in 5th?
Very little. So
Sentences, parse, label, translate?
I don't do sentences. The most I'll do with them is they know that the genitive case is known by this token of, right? And they know that haec Musa, for example, means amuse. So I will ask them, how do you say of amuse in Latin then? And I expect them to be able to say of amuse would be huius musae, because of is the case, the genitive case is the of case, and muse is haec Musa. So of amuse would be huius musae. So maybe like one word translations like that I'll have them do. But beyond that, I don't have them translate sentences because we haven't got to verbs yet.
So in the 5th grade, you're having them go all the way through the 5th declension.
Mm-hmm.
Not
and adjectives and pronouns.
You have them do Latin C in 5th grade? Okay, we're one behind. Sorry, you had your hand raised.
When you say Latin C, you mean?
Latin for children.
We don't do Latin for children anymore. We're just using this curriculum that I based on William Lillie's curriculum.
What do your homework assignments look like for Latin?
Purely memorization. So
Nothing written. This time.
Well, sometimes when we introduce like a new declension, I'll have them write it out on a piece of paper 2 or 3 times. And if that's not finished by the end of the class period, I'll tell them to go home and finish that at home. So they do practice writing out the declensions and the conjugations to know that they know the spelling. And you know what they love is, you ever played Sparkle? Yeah, they bug me every day. Let's play Sparkle in Latin. Let's play Sparkle in Latin. And it's amazing to me because it's a game that requires such intense concentration and knowing letter for letter the spelling of every single declension and that they've learned. But they love it. It's all they want to do.
So what do you do in your Sparkle? The I am.
So for example, we would do haec Musa, for example. And they would, some people play Sparkle, you get out if you're the Sparkle. I just let them stay in unless they get something wrong. So we'll start with haec Musa, and the person will say H-A-E-C, Sparkle, M-U-S-A, and then we'll go through all the forms of haec Musa that way.
So you said memorization in class. What does that look like?
It looks, it involves chanting, which as you would be familiar with in any Latin classroom. So we stand up and I make them shout at the top of their lungs the declension. I used to let them just do it at whatever volume they wanted to do it. But then I watched this like really old-fashioned Latin teacher, and he said you have to make them shout it. that it creates some kind of communal experience that helps them memorize it better. And since then, I've made them just like shout it at the top of their lungs. Like after we finish like a chanting review, they're like, they're like out of breath. It's like a workout. But I just make it them completely shout it. Then I'll drill individual students on particular forms. I'll say, what's the genitive plural of hike Musa? I'll say, what's the dative singular? And we'll drill a lot that way. Sometimes we'll do that in a game format. We'll have them come up to the board and do around the world or do races or that sort of thing to see who can come up with the form the quickest. That helps a lot. I will have them do review games where I'll like split them into teams, be a team here, and I'll give them each a declension. Like this side will be doing hike Musa, this side will be doing hic magister. And in teams, they have to take turns writing one form up on the board and then going to the back of the line, and the next person writes one form on the board and goes to the back of the line. And you can correct one form as well. So if you can use your turn to correct a form that somebody's done wrong, and that also helps them a lot in reviewing those. So I try to do it out loud. I try to give them a visual reference. I try to have them write it out. I try to hit all those things that you would normally want to hit to help somebody memorize something.
What about test assessments? How do they look for you?
Tests or assessments probably look pretty similar to what you would see in another elementary Latin classroom. I'll ask them for the new declension we've learned that week to give me the paradigm forms, and I'll require correct spelling and to be in the correct order and all that sort of thing. Sometimes I'll put a couple of review paradigms on there so that they're having to retain the ones they've learned before. The most creative quiz I've probably given them so far is a noun adjective agreement quiz, where I think I did something like hic meridie's bonus. So they had to have a fifth declension noun agreeing with a first and second declension adjective. And we had practiced that enough in class that they did fairly well on that, actually. But nothing terribly creative, just testing their memories. I'll also, since we've memorized all these definitions for grammar terms, like the genitive case is known by this token of and answers the question whose or of whom or of what, I'll put questions like that on a quiz as well. What is a genitive case? And I'll expect them to give me the definition that we've learned in class.
Speaking as someone who has a daughter in that 5th grade class, it was a rocky road for her when she began this kind of instruction at the beginning of the year, because she was one of those smile, nod my head, and do everything I'm told to do, and then I get my grade that I'm expecting to get. And so when she figured out throughout the course of her first semester this year that that wasn't going to work, and that she had to actually come home and not only just speak over and over again, each spelling even down to the letter, but she had to, for her to be able to really do well on the quizzes, she had to pull out a piece of paper and go, what do I remember? And I have to write it down where it goes, and then do it again. Probably 35 sheets later, she has it and it's there, and she hasn't lost it. But she's never had to study that way before. It forced her to find out what was the best way for her to internalize the information so she can use it later. It's been a huge difference. And I'll just be honest with you, she failed the first semester, flat failed Latin. And that woke her up to, okay, there's something I'm not doing right. And now she has an A in it, because she realized this is not just about going through the motions, smiling and filling out a worksheet that I don't know anything about. It's about me actually being able to tell mom what these are and know about them and internalize. It's been it's convinced me watching her struggle through it and figure out what she needs to do.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around spending time through the whole year in class and not having them. You said you have, do they memorize Hic, Haec, Hope? And
one of the
same things?
Yes, one of the interesting things about the way William Lillie handles the noun paradigms, he always has them decline a noun along with its article, so a form of hic, haec, hoc.
Yeah.
And at first I thought this was kind of weird, because this is what a contemporary Latin curriculum generally does, but it's a pattern that goes all the way back to the ancient grammarians like Donatus and Dionysius Thrax. And I've found it to be very helpful for them, actually. It's a little bit intimidating at first because they have to memorize 2 forms, not just one. But it actually considerably reduces the ambiguity, especially of something like the first declension. Yeah. Because as you know, in the first declension, we have the ending I for 3 different forms. Right. And it can be very confusing, especially when you're a black and white elementary school thinker, to tell those 3 forms apart. But if you've got huyus musai and huik musai and hai musai, suddenly those forms don't, I mean, they still look similar, but suddenly you can tell them apart because of their article. So it's something that seemed weird to me at first, but I've sort of seen the logic of it as I've used it in practice.
And as they're declining that, do you have them write the meanings in there also?
I don't. We sometimes review the meanings, and especially when we're doing things like playing games, I'll drill them a lot on the meanings. I like my games to be harder than my tests. So I try to throw stuff into my games that is going to be harder than what they're going to see on a quiz. And that's one of the places I like to use that. It's something that I know that not every student is going to master at that age. So it's something I want them to see a lot and get exposed to, but it's not necessarily something I'm going to test them over.
So in 7th grade you start vocabulary?
In 6th grade we start working through Wheelocks. I'm thinking of actually switching to Henley next year. Because I like it has a much similar grammatical progression to what we're using in the elementary school now.
So that's the point where you use pictures or stories?
Or just translation sentences. And then I think they'll be retaining the vocabulary a lot better because they'll be seeing the vocabulary in a meaningful context.
Wow.
So in just the early grammar stage for 2nd, 3rd grade, what are they introduced to any Latin?
We start Latin in the 1st grade. We use the song school Latin, which seems to be working well. I think it gets them really comfortable with Latin, so they're not as intimidated by it when they study it in the further grades. In 3rd and 4th grade, we're using the same curriculum that I developed for 5th grade, and it's kind of in a beta state. I'm looking to add on to it. So my hope is that they'll actually have the noun forms and the verb forms memorized by the time they get to 6th and 7th grade. But since we're all starting everybody fresh on this, we just started everybody out on nouns and adjectives and pronouns.
So then you just repeat the same things in the 5th grade?
There'll be some repetition because I want us to review and retain those forms that we've learned previously. But my plan is for them, what my 5th graders are studying now is what I want my 3rd graders to have mastered by the time they move on to 4th grade. And we'll build on in 4th and 5th grade.
I've been thinking of ways to try and support the Latin curriculum in memory time, and we've had a few discussions about that. But as I'm reminded with your words today, I wonder, do you think it would be beneficial? I know they have to have a context or the vocabulary, you're just wasting your time. And so with a picture context, would that be enough for the young kids to be able to give some kind of meaning to what they're learning? If I was to pull up a picture of whatever whatever word, the meaning of the word on the screen behind me as they're learning those songs in memory time, do you think that would be worth the time? That's the question I have. Because I'd really like to develop that, but I don't want to do it if you feel like they're not ready for that.
Yeah, I think that could work, especially for stuff that's very concrete.
Right.
So I think you could definitely teach them puer and puella that way.
Yeah.
And wir and femina and those sorts of things. Right. They get those really well from pictures. There's some vocabulary that's a little bit more on the abstract side that I don't think it would work so well with that. But yeah, I definitely think you could teach some vocabulary that way.
Okay. So even just basic nouns, or I have several pictures I pulled up just like for geographic terms, things that you can have a great picture for that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
I was also thinking one of the sessions talked about making it funny and associating, like, for instance, the word argentum. Mm-hmm. Making a pirate loves silver.
Right.
They love the loot. So, I mean, doing fun stuff like that might.
Yeah. I used to have a 4th grader that would come up with the craziest ways to memorize nouns. Like he'd say, Mr. Mosley, I remember now that donum means gift, because donum sounds like donut. And when you do donuts in your car, you might be swirling around and around and get really dizzy and fall out of your car and hurt yourself. And then you'd have to go to the hospital, and you'd be in the hospital, and everyone would feel sorry for you, and they'd come and bring you flowers as a gift. And I'd be like, buddy, if that works for you, That's great.
Much easier. You will never forget that word.
Yeah,
Ever.
that's one of the things they teach you in like the memory palace thing, right? Is make your mnemonics as ridiculous as possible. I guess he had an intuitive sense of how to do that.
So wouldn't it be true that when Lillie first wrote this, the students he had would have experienced Latin in other contexts outside of school, like church or those kind of things? But they would have already seen and heard in context, and so therefore pulling out paradigms would have been logical. But if we don't have that context, are we starting in a false place?
Well, I take your point that they probably would have had much more exposure to Latin than an average school child today, in the sense that they would have been exposed to the Latin liturgy and that sort of thing. How much they would have understood of all that is a good question. Possibly more than I might expect.
Well, even
Possibly
just
not.
like the beauty aspect of where is this language going? Are we taking that too far if we're only looking at doing paradigms and there's no context until a few years later?
Yeah. My experience with elementary students is that they don't worry too much about context. So I'm happy giving them something that's a little bit decontextualized at that age, and then filling in the context later on. I don't see that harming them, but I take your point that this language is ultimately meant to be used in a communicative context, and we are, in a sense, doing something a little bit unnatural with it at first. I think in pursuit of goals that are consistent with the natural use of language, but I take your point that it is a little bit artificial.
Do you, at the elementary level, introduce any Roman culture at all?
A little bit. Like, so their example of a first declension noun is haec Musa, a muse. So that's a great opportunity to just have a discussion about what a muse was and fill in some details about Roman culture like that. But with the 5th graders, I have them for like 30 minutes a day. So my priority is stuff that they're going to master and retain later on. And then when we get into 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th grade, we have all sorts of great discussions about Roman history and Roman culture.
So I'm sorry, I think I just missed that. How long are your Latin classes?
In the 5th grade, I have them for 30 minutes a day.
Like 5 days a week?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's a short class.
It is very short. In 6th and 7th, I get to have them for a 50-minute period, 5 times.
Every day?
Yeah, every day. And then that's true of 8th grade as well. In the high school, I get to have them for about 2.5 periods a week in 9th and 10th grade. So the time gets cut down a little bit.
So when they do begin their translation, is it open book? Can they look in the glossary for their meanings then, or?
I have done it both ways. I have given them translation tests where I expect them, especially in 6th and 7th grade, where I expect them to just know how to translate it. Those don't usually go so well. I've experimented with like letting them use a dictionary, and that seems to help a lot. In 8th, 9th, and 10th, all their tests are unseen translations that they don't get any references for.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might be the only one that does lingua in the grammar stage, but I was wondering about pacing. You said 8th, 9th, and 10th you do lingua.
Mm-hmm.
Do you try to finish the first book in those 3 years?
I couldn't possibly.
Okay.
No. Yeah. So
About what would you do for the 8th graders in 1 year? How many chapters would you do?
in the past, I have been lucky to get through maybe 9 with a group that hasn't been exposed to Latin before. But my 8th graders that I have now have done several years of Latin, and they're a little bit more comfortable with it. So I think I'm going to be doing more chapters, maybe as many as 11 or 12.
Okay.
And then probably cover 6 more a year in the, and that has a lot to do with just the shortage of time. Sure. Since I only have them about two and a half periods. I have them together on Fridays, which is why I say 2.5 periods. The freshmen and the sophomores is what I mean to say. I have them together on Fridays during the same period. So roughly 2.5 periods a week. So I can't cover quite as much material in that limited time frame.
What kind of supplements do you use with Lingua? I mean, as far as like games and resources and stuff like that.
Yeah, we play Latin Pictionary, especially in the 8th grade when I have them for 5 periods a week. There's a lot of time to do games and review stuff like that. We use all 4 books in that series, by which I mean the Familia Romana text, the Exercitia Latina, the Colloquia Personarum, and the College Companion.
Yeah.
So they have all 4 of those books at their disposal.
So you actually, they buy the college, the handbook?
The school provides it for them,
Okay,
yeah.
that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I tell them about that is it's not something I want to see them using during class, because I think that goes against Warburg's method.
Sure.
For them to just be, again, looking at a vocabulary list instead of trying to deduce the meaning of the word from context, which is a valuable skill, even in non-Latin contexts, to be able to look at a work of English even and deduce the word of an unknown word from the context. Anyway, so it's not something I can encourage them. In fact, I actively discourage them from using it in class. But I say if you're at home and you're doing homework and you're stuck on a word you don't know, that College Companion is there to sort of bail you out, to be the teacher when I'm not there. Yep. Yes?
I'm going to be I am the administrator of a new school. We're opening in 18.
Mhm.
So where would we start with, say, our 5th or 6th grade class? You know, what curriculum would we use?
I would say you could do a couple of things. You could use one of the standard curricula that's out there, Memoria Press or Classical Academic Press, and you could just focus on the stuff that's going to be mastered, which is the paradigms. And I would recommend trying to supplement that with at least with some sort of grammatical catechism, something where the teacher can ask, what is the nominative case? And they can give some kind of canned response that they're going to be able to retain later on. I don't know of any commercially available resources like that, but it wouldn't be too hard for someone familiar with Latin to come up with something like that, especially if they could look at Lillie's curriculum as an example. So I would recommend starting there, or the English, the public school grammar primer that I mentioned earlier, that was based on William Lillie, is actually a pretty put together curriculum. It's a 19th century Victorian curriculum, so it looks like a modern book. It doesn't look like a Renaissance, incunabula like the William Lillie text does. So that could almost work right out of the box. The only disadvantage of the English grammar school primer is that the German philosophy of linguistic study is beginning to become influential in England at that time. So the grammar is starting to move away from being how do I use this language, which is what the humanists were concerned with, to how do we study this language scientifically. So the English grammar school primer is starting to get in the sort of scientific linguistic direction, and therefore it sometimes gets into detail that they just don't need to be able to use the language intelligently. But I think a judicious use of that could also work at that level. All right, are we at time?
So are you going to be publishing your work?
Maybe. It's still, like I said, it's still in kind of a beta stage right now, but hopefully I can get it into a shape where...
To at least have your short definitions of the...
Sure.
Each.
Yeah, send me an email. I'd be happy to send you at least my catechism, so you can look over that and see if it'd be something that would be beneficial.
I feel like right now I'm banging my head against the wall with the vocabulary. It is so frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Lillie's work is obviously, it's not copyrighted, it's free.
No, yeah, it's absolutely free. Yeah, you can take that and make your own derivative works of it.
Right.
No problem. All right.
Perhaps just sticking with vocabulary that had obvious derivatives might help also.
Yeah, the derivatives, they find the derivatives interesting, but I haven't noticed it help too well with retention for some reason. You would think it would.
Yeah, I know.
But I haven't found that to be the case. Thanks for coming, everybody.